Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Yoon, Director of Public Affairs and Regional Issues at KEI. We welcome you today on behalf of KEI and the East-West Center in Washington. I would like to welcome you to the third installment of the Korea Compass series that we've started in October last year, exploring Korea's global engagements around the world, especially with developing regions and developing countries. And today, KEI and the East-West Center in Washington are co-sponsoring this installment of Korea Compass series titled Triangle with a Gap, Korea, Southeast Asia, U.S. relations. And this is to explore Korea's growing engagements in Southeast Asia and the potential for Korea, U.S., Southeast Asia triangulation of policies. We're very pleased to be collaborating with this event with the East-West Center in Washington. We believe this is a very timely topic, and given the U.S. pivot in Asia, and also the Korea's New Asia initiative under President Lee, and also a very underexplored topic as well. So we're thrilled to be partnering with the East-West Center, and would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Satu Limaye for allowing this partnership and helping to make this event possible. Today we have three distinguished speakers with us today. Dr. Balbina Hwang will discuss Korea's engagements in Southeast Asia. Dr. Satu Limaye will discuss U.S. engagement with Southeast Asia. And Dr. Ellen Frost will discuss Korea's role in the trade and economic regionalism in the Asia Pacific. And all three speakers will discuss and touch upon the significance and the future prospects for Korea, Southeast Asia, and the U.S. to work together. You should have walked in with papers. There are a series of 3 papers that each of our speakers wrote today, touching upon these areas that I just talked about. So please take a look at them. Our speakers worked on it overnights and over weekends, and we're very grateful for that. Before starting the presentations, I would like to introduce you to the speakers. First is Dr. Balbina Hwang, who is a visiting professor at Georgetown University, where she teaches courses on Asian politics and political economy. From 2007 to 2009, she served as senior special advisor to Ambassador Christopher Hill, Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. From 2009 to 2010, she taught Northeast Asian security at the National Defense University. Prior to joining the State Department, she was a senior policy analyst for Northeast Asia in the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation and a lecturer at Georgetown University. She earned her PhD in government from Georgetown, master's in international affairs from Columbia, MBA from Darden Business School at the University of Virginia, and a BA in philosophy and government from Smith College. Our second speaker is Dr. Satu Limaye, who's a director of the East-West Center in Washington and the senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analysis. Prior to his East-West Center appointment, he was a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis and director of the Research and Publications Division at the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. He received his PhD in International Relations from Oxford University, graduated from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. He's a former Abe Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and a former Henry Luce Scholar. He has taught at Georgetown University and has been a member of Sophia University's Faculty of Comparative Culture in Tokyo, Japan. Last but not least, Dr. Ellen Frost is a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and adjunct research fellow at the National Defense University's Institute of National Strategic Studies. She previously served in the U.S. government as counselor to the U.S. Trade Representative and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Economics and Technology Affairs, among many other positions in the State Department and the Treasury. She received her PhD from the Department of Government at Harvard, where she specialized in the politics and foreign policy of China, MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and BA from Radcliffe College. So it's clear that we're in this room in the midst of experts in the area, in the region, the topic that we're discussing today. And I would like to thank all the speakers for being here. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to the first speaker, Dr. Hwang.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, first of all. And also thank you to KEI and also EWC
for hosting this event. I want to commend KI very much for this Korea Compass series because I think it's a really unique and interesting way of looking at Korea not just in an isolated way, which is how we tend to do it, but to look at Korea, basically turn the compass a little bit and look at Korea through different angles. And I was really excited when Sarah invited me to participate in this panel because I have been trying to venture out of my Northeast Asian neighborhood and look at more of Korea's relationship with the globe. So this was a very perfect way to sort of press me to put together some ideas. So I hope you'll take a look at the paper. There's a lot of information in there. It's a little lengthy. And I only have 15 minutes, so I'll have to be brief in my remarks. Now, if any of you are like me, you may have thought that rain is just a meteorological phenomenon. But apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal, if that's the case, then you are out of the buzz stream, which I clearly am, as my students also accuse me of. Rain apparently is a very, very hot Korean pop star. And he's extremely popular around the globe, not as much here in the United States, but certainly in Southeast Asia. And I discovered this firsthand when I was out at a meeting a couple of years ago at our embassy in Seoul, when we had brought in some of our staff from Southeast Asia, all over Asia, to a meeting in Seoul. And one of our counselors begged me to show him, after hours, a place where he could buy a rain calendar or other memorabilia for his daughter, who's living in Bangkok, and she desperately wanted all sorts of tchotchkes about rain. She was obsessed with it. So I thought, well, now this is something very interesting is going on. And of course, you all are very much aware of this. This is the Hallyu, the Korean wave, that has swept like a tidal wave through shores all over the world. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, I was pretty surprised. You go to Bangkok and you see, and I saw signs in shops that said, you know, Korean haircuts. And I thought, what in the world does that mean? But it's because these shows and Korean dramas and pop stars are so popular that everybody wants to emulate them. And by the way, this is not just the cities of Bangkok. It's small corners in Laos, Cambodia, all over. So there's something behind this phenomenon, and what is it? Well, in part, what I'd like to do is go through the three main ways of looking at this. And the first is to look at Korea's global strategy. And after that, I'll briefly mention basically why Southeast Asia and how that fits into Korea's global strategy. And then finally, some comments about this idea about the US-Korea relationship and where this might fit in. Now, interestingly, I think you're all very familiar with Lee Myung-bak's Global Korea vision, which he's been very successful in launching. But what the interesting part is that's actually not new. I mean, it is visionary, but in fact, Korea came up with this 세계화 or globalization policy much, much earlier. Actually, 1993. This was the sort of brainchild of President Kim Young-sam. The problem with it was a great vision. Right, but ultimately it was only that. It was really only a vision, and notably, the real irony behind it is, although it was meant to try to bring Korea closer into this age of globalization, in fact, it was really about changing Korea's domestic structure, and it was as a reaction to changes in the global economy. And again, details are in the paper. So, really, 세계화. Failure is too strong a word, but it was not effective because the Korean government was not able to put in the proper institutions, and they essentially did not have the right capabilities back in '93 to carry this out effectively. And again, also because the focus was really about changes in the domestic structures. So now, in 2008, Lee Myung-bak becomes president. And in some ways, he was very lucky. He inherited a very different Korea, right? And several months into his presidency, of course, the global financial crisis occurs. Now, of course, a very unfortunate event, but lucky for Lee Myung-bak in some ways, because what it did was it really opened up a new forum for him to start launching and implementing this vision that he had about global Korea. And what I mean by that is, for example, it was very clear by November, December of 2008, that the old model, the G7, right, of the richest countries, essentially Western countries, coming together to manage the global economy was not working. And so the G20, which of course had been created earlier, but really had no momentum, suddenly became the spotlight. And it became the primary forum for which the world was looking for leadership to fix the global economy. And so Lee Myung-bak was able to say, I am going to host the next one. And it was really a brilliant strategy. As you all know, it was the first time that a non-G7 country had hosted. And of course, Korea is still very much, I mean, is it a developing country? Is it a developed country? It's actually both of those things. And in fact, if you look at the countries of the G20s, Korea sits exactly in the middle. I mean, 10 above and 10 below, where, and by the way, Korea is the only country in the G20 whose GDP per capita sits in the 20s range, the 20,000 range. The other 9 are above, well above, in the 30s and 40s, and the other 9 are well below, in the thousands. So, again, a little advertisement. We had written, KEI had done a big forum a couple of years ago, academic series. And so there's a lengthy paper on the G20 there, if you're interested. And so Korea, which for centuries, as you all know, has suffered from this shrimp among whales syndrome, right? This tiny little country always getting pushed and pulled and squashed by larger powers, suddenly found an interesting opening, right? To be able to start exerting some of its middle power status in very interesting ways. And so Lee Myung-bak's global Korea vision was really the way in which he could tie this all together. And so hosting the G20 was one of them. Lee Myung-bak will be hosting, of course, the nuclear summit later this month. And so there were a series of these very high-profile meetings. Now, so where does Southeast Asia fit into all of this? Now, Southeast Asia is actually not a new region. It's not like suddenly Columbus went and discovered it, right? Southeast Asia has obviously always been there. Korea's relations with Southeast Asian countries have been long, but not necessarily that robust. They formally began in 1989 when South Korea formally adopted a treaty of cooperation with ASEAN, and then slowly began to grow from there. And then, of course, by 2007, 2009, South Korea was able to implement a free trade area with ASEAN in trades and in services. And so the connections had always been there. But what's interesting is Lee Myung-bak in March of 2009 goes on a state visit to Southeast Asia. And he announces this new initiative called the New Asia Initiative. Now, it's important to understand the context of this. As I mentioned, when he comes into office in early 2008, comes in and he prioritizes his energy on reestablishing very close cooperation and coordination with the typical and traditional South Korean interests, right, which is the United States, and then, of course, China, Japan. All around this issue of course, North Korea, which is really the bubbling issue in the middle. By the end of 2008, he says, okay, I've done a really good job of stabilizing relations, of establishing really good and close cooperation. Now it's time to launch out into the rest of the world. And so with this New Asia Initiative, he basically said, we are going to now go out and actively engage and use all of our abilities, our soft power, our middle power status, to try to elevate not only our relations with different regions of the world, but also to play a leadership role in Asia. And so the New Asia Initiative was not just about Southeast Asia, interestingly, but also about Central Asia and broader Asia, including South Asia. And if you don't have a topic, that might be your next topic, is looking at Central Asia. It's actually a very, very interesting development. In any case, so, and as Lee Myung-bak said, South Korea can play the bridging role. And I think this is actually the most intriguing aspect, because, in fact, South Korea really can. I mean, it's not as big as China and Japan. It's certainly not the United States. Yeah. But as we know, Southeast Asia is a conglomerate of very, very wide-ranging countries, some quite large, Indonesia, Thailand, some tiny, Laos, and also different stages of development. So South Korea is really the perfect country to play this role. It's a question of how active they can do it and how well they can implement it. And notice that, South Korea also doesn't quite carry the same baggage that the other larger powers do. China and Japan, their history is obviously very long in Southeast, through all of Asia. But because of South Korea's unique position, as having been actually in the position of most of the Southeast Asian countries, dominated for centuries, culturally, socially, politically, by the Chinese Empire at one point, obviously occupied and colonized by Japan, brutally, which many Southeast Asian countries also experienced. And South Korea has basically been there. It's been, bullied and told what to do by great powers. It's had the colonial experience. Most importantly, it's had the experience of being utterly destroyed, having fought civil wars, not having the modern institutions and structures, but then being able to build them, and build them in a spectacularly successful way. And so it is really actually a very inspirational model for Southeast Asians, but also a model that can easily, or I should say more readily, acceptable and applicable and followed than the Chinese model or the Japanese model, which just seem almost a bridge too far for many Southeast Asian countries. Now, I see my time is quickly wrapping up, so let me just conclude then by a couple of things. So how has South Korea done this in just the last 2 or 3 years? Well, first of all, it's been the strong support of institutional capacities to do it. So, for example, the Korea Development Institute has set up all sorts of training programs to bring in bureaucrats from Southeast Asia. They've been very successful. The Korea Foundation has worked on increasing scholarships and other development programs. The crucial component is that South Korea joined the OECD's DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, which is the arm of the which is the grouping that manages foreign investments or development aid. And of course, now that Korea has joined this group, Korea has graduated from a recipient to a donor. Just to give you a figure, in 2009, Korea's ODA budget was $862 million. By this year, they're planning to double it. By 2015, triple it. And Southeast Asia will be a primary target for most of this ODA. Now, of course, Koreans, being Koreans, very commercial, have sort of invaded Southeast Asia. And as one Cambodian official said, the Koreans are coming, and they keep coming, and they're not stopping. And the other countries are very slow. And of course, so Korean investments, commercial, private investments, have just exploded throughout the region. So let me a final statement then about what this means for the US-ROK alliance. Now, we should note that in 2009, the United States and South Korea came up and announced a joint vision for the alliance. As we all know, the South Korean experience for the last 60 years has essentially been dominated in this structure, right? The Cold War ended in the rest of the world, still exists on the Korean Peninsula. So South Korea is still very dependent on the alliance as the overarching structure, not just for its security, but for the way it's handled its foreign policy. The alliance clearly is still relevant, and it will be relevant for a very long time. What the joint vision has done has tried to find a way to adapt, while keeping the structure of the alliance there, is tried to adapt it to the new world. And it really set up these goalposts for how the structure can be used for both South Korea and the US to expand and build and basically spread many of the values that have helped to make South Korea so successful to other regions. And so South Korea's engagement of Southeast Asia, while it has been largely done outside the structure of the alliance, in many ways very much reinforces and supports the goals and visions of the alliance. And so I think it is something that the two work very well together. I'm not so sure it's a very formal triangle. It's sort of a loose, wobbly sort of triangle. But it is there, it's very important, and I think there's certainly a room to build upon it, which I think my other two speakers will address. So thank you.
Should I? Okay, well, let me join in thank Balbina and Ellen, of course, in thanking you, Sarah, and Jack Pritchard and KEI for hosting this wonderful event. It's been a delight to work with you, Sarah, and KEI, and the East-West Center is delighted to do that. And I also want to congratulate you for this Compass program, because as I was looking at it, as I mentioned to you when we first started discussing this program, some months ago I was asked to come to New York for another organization that deals with Korea to talk about India's role in Asia. And I was struck by it because, in a way, this program strikes me as representative of the kinds of shifts that are going on in the conception of the region, in the geography of the region, in the relationships in the region. I remember, too far ago now to remember precisely exactly the date, but Sarah mentioned I was on a Luce scholarship, and those of you who know the Luce scholarship program know that one of the criteria for being a candidate, or to be certainly a successful candidate, is not to have any Asia experience at all. And I remember inquiring when I was applying whether it was okay for someone who had been born in India but was an American who'd grown up in Seattle. And they said, no, India's not in Asia.
Not according to the State Department either.
And I mention that now because I see Professor Osman here, and he gave us an orientation at Princeton, and as a Middle East guy who'd worked on Israel and Lebanon and had gone to do a PhD on Lebanon, I was struck that India wasn't in Asia, because when I went west of India, everyone thought it was. So my point in coming back to this is to sort of think anew about these connections, and I really do want to congratulate you. And it's all the more ironic because we now talk about Southeast Asian centrality. And I spent all morning looking at historical maps, primarily American atlases from the 1830s and 1840s, when atlases began to boom. And we didn't really have Southeast Asia on an American atlas till roughly 1860, 1857, or the first time when we represented Southeast Asia in a coherent way. And so to talk about its centrality is very new and interesting thing. You have a paper, so I'm not going to belabor it. I thought I would hit some highlights, at least from my perception. And that is to start out with a general hypothesis, a sort of statement, as it were, that Southeast Asia and ASEAN are in fact critical to the American pivot towards the Asia-Pacific and towards rebalancing, and I'll try to demonstrate why. In the first part of the paper, I talk about 10 policy steps we've done, and they're well known to an audience like this, I think, but I'll simply list them and you can get some of the details in the paper, because what I want to focus on are what I consider to be some structural, fundamental changes in U.S. Southeast Asia policy, ones that I think are going to be with us for a while as part and parcel of these policy steps that we've taken. Talk about two major challenges to our Southeast Asia relationships. There are many. I've categorized them two. I can't go to high numbers. And then end with some comments about where the U.S.-Southeast Asia relationship might implicate the U.S.-Korea relationship, at least from a stratospheric point of view. The 10 things that we've done in Southeast Asia, and the White House, the State Department, NSC, and DOD are all to be congratulated on, I think, rather a very active and successful set of efforts. One is, of course, signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which paved the way for our joining EAS this last November with President Obama representing the United States. Second, designating ASEAN as the fulcrum of regional architecture building. And I want to distinguish between regional architecture building, which is kind of a term Ellen and I go back and forth as friends and talk about. Neither of us are very happy with. In fact, I'm quite puzzled by the mechanical nature of our descriptions of all U.S.-Asia interactions these days. Architecture, fulcrums, pivots, rebalancing. I feel like I'm in an old engineering class. But anyways, there we are. We have it, and it's architecture. And but architecture is not order. And I think that's an important difference that we'll run into as an ongoing part of our challenge is what is architecture and groupings and what is order building, and those are two different things. The third is the ambassador to ASEAN. We were the first to do so. The fourth is increasingly useful and outcome-oriented U.S.-ASEAN summits. The fifth is strengthening alliances, partnerships, and re-engagements, particularly Burma in recent days, but also building comprehensive partnerships with Indonesia, for example, kind of rebooting our relationship with Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera. Five others I just simply point to is a clear principled statement on South China Sea, which is intended to both reassure, dissuade, and deter. I think embedding that issue in bilateral as well as multilateral settings is an important piece of success for us. A seventh is the TPP, moving forward with that discussion. I mean, I personally have no idea how long that process will take, but it's certainly initiated in an important process. And it lays a platform for future membership of other countries, whether it be Thailand or the Philippines in Southeast Asia. Obviously, Japan, Canada, Mexico have expressed interest, and goodness knows, in the long term, China. Eighth, a defense posture, and you all know in this room the three elements of kind of the recalibrated defense posture, which is geographically distributed, operationally resilient, and politically sustainable. And then finally, the Lower Mekong Initiative, and of course, supporting ASEAN capacity building to create the kind of coherence for these 10 countries, which are in fact, widely disparate in so many ways, but to build some capability and capacity within ASEAN to handle regional integration, to act in, if not a unitary way, in some sort of cohesive way. So those are the 10 kind of policy steps. But I think they are part of a larger engagement with Asia built on three pillars, which is alliances, partnerships, and as the President said in his speech in Australia, all in on multilateral institutions. Which leads me, maybe some of you have the ASEAN Matters brochure, so I'll skip over why ASEAN is important in material trade terms, export terms, student terms. I mean, I think all the data is in there and is fairly easy to absorb. Let me talk about, I think, the sort of fundamental structural things that are going on, which have been engaging my interest. The first, I think, is Burma. I think it can't be underestimated how important, if the Burma re-engagement or rapprochement, whatever word you want to use for it, goes forward, because Burma, in some sense, was a constraint to our engagement with ASEAN as a whole, both institutionally and with Southeast Asia. It was so for protocol reasons, it was for sanctions and legal reasons, it was for political optics reasons, all kinds of reasons that we could only do certain things. I'm not going to go into all the details, whether you could invite certain ministers and if there were 9 + 1, and how would the summit look if the Burmese leadership was standing next to the president. There were all these kinds of very specific issues in Burma. And so the rapprochement with Burma is not, I think, significant only in the terms of Burma, but significant in removing, if you will, or mitigating a constraint in overall engagement with ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And I think that's important structurally and fundamentally. We'll have to see how that process goes, and hopefully the SPDC will not turn back the clock. I think the second point I'd make about structural changes in U.S. Southeast Asia is a fundamental beginnings of addressing the imbalance in our relationships with mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. Of course, we haven't, it's neither, it's too simplified in 15 minutes to say, we've been this and that on ones, but it's clear that since the end of the Vietnam War, our opportunities for and our engagement with the countries of mainland Southeast Asia have been limited. We just talked about Burma, but clearly Cambodia, Laos, even Vietnam, which has been a 15-year kind of trajectory of improvement of relations, has been limited or constrained. Composition of communist governments, historical issues, all kinds of constraints that we could go into. But also because in some sense the maritime countries of Southeast Asia are highly important to the U.S. Interests, whether they be maritime and sea lane issues, whether they be alliance partnerships, and good close partnership, if not allies, like in the case of Singapore. And again, as I said, it's not perfect, but if you deconstruct the numbers, what's fascinating is almost 85% of our trade and 90% of U.S. foreign direct investment has been in maritime Southeast Asia, not in mainland. And the only outlier there is Thailand, which is 85% of what's in mainland Southeast Asia. So if you deconstruct both between mainland and maritime and within mainland, you get a very textured picture of the way in which the U.S. is engaged. And that balance is beginning to be addressed as we engage with mainland Southeast Asia. So I think that's a very important thing. The third thing is the move from bilateral and global approach to Southeast Asia. We had bilateral interests and we had sort of global interests. But because of the changing Asia-Pacific security order and the rise of China, and because of ASEAN's adoption of the Charter and very incremental cohesion, we now have to deal with ASEAN as an institution. So there's a midpoint between the bilateral and global. And that's very important because it mitigates some of the extremes of U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia. And extremes, I mean here only that the long-running difficulties in calibrating. Are we only interested in the war on terror? Are we only interested in the Cold War? Are we only interested in human rights? The development of Southeast Asia, the opening of Southeast Asia, the globalization of Southeast Asia allows us to intersect with that as an institution and as a sub-region in the context of our overall Asia policy. And I think that's important. The fourth is the calibration of our multilateral engagements with bilateral. In every case where we've moved in regional institutions over the last 2-3 years, we've done so through very good working relationships with the country that was chair of ASEAN. So in the case of Vietnam, in the July 10, 2010 statement on ASEAN Regional Forum about our interest on maritime issues, we've done it in part because we spent 15 years developing the bilat with Vietnam. And no relationship is perfect, but we couldn't, I think, have gotten there had we not built that relationship. And I think that's a very important. It also works in reverse. We've been able to implicate multilateral institutions into key issues that we think are policy important. So East Asia Summit this last November was able to take up maritime issues, not only because Indonesia was a chair with whom we have a comprehensive partnership, but because we have now worked systematically to lay the groundwork to use the institution to policy ends. And the final thing I would just note is what I call the three balances. The first is the balance in issues we're engaged. As I said, we're not extremed on any issue. We're engaged across the board: social issues, democracy, governance, human rights, capacity building, military exercise. So I think that's one balance. I think what I call in the paper full spectrum balance. The second balance, I think, is engagement across, as I said, bilateral, ASEAN, and wider regional vectors, which allows us to keep a very steady and kind of full-on approach. And the third balance is between the supply and demand for U.S. engagement. What I think we're seeing in the region is whatever concerns there may be about our ability to remain engaged because of our own economic difficulties, I think wildly overstated, but nevertheless the constraints that are, the concerns that are expressed. I think many countries in the region, including in Southeast Asia, are helping to prop up ability of the U.S. to supply public goods. So whether it's littoral combat ships in Singapore, or strengthening the alliance with Thailand or the Philippines, I mean, all of these things help us to maintain our ability to provide the reassurance that's sought in the region. Two challenges. The first is China. You'd not be surprised. I think my simple tagline is clearly China is an animating issue for the U.S. re-engagement with Asia. It's an important issue. It's an issue that our friends in the region and others express as an important issue for the U.S. to remain engaged. But I'm always cautious that we can't have an either-or approach. And China's important to us. China's important to all the countries. As I say in my paper, we can't have a G2 with China because it undermines reassurance to our friends and allies, and it undermines multilateral institutions which are required to manage China's rise. At the same time, we can't have an alliances only, or what I call a Cold War II approach, which privileges only the allies for the simple reason that that would polarize a region which is increasingly integrating with China and trading with China, just as we are. And it also undermines broader security and stability. And the second challenge is multilateralism. Sure, we're all in, which is a terrific place to be, I think, in the new evolving scenario. But staying in is going to be a consistent and persistent challenge. Getting the right issues incorporated into the right institutions is going to be important. Getting the hierarchy and the management of these institutions right is going to be an issue. Getting the right stakeholders at the table will be important. And so we've got a lot of work to do since these organizations are still very much in their evolutionary stage. And I would characterize that as the second big challenge to institutionalize American presence in the region. Let me end with a couple of comments on where does Korea fit. Balbina has wonderfully talked about soft power, talked about South Korea's bridging role, talked about in some senses as an exemplar for aspects of South Korean incredible success on economic development and democratization. I guess I'd make a couple of broad comments. One is that first and foremost, we can't see these two relationships, US-Southeast Asia or US-Korea, as mutually exclusive or zero-sum. I think it's important because there's always an anxiety if we're engaged in one place, we'll be less engaged in another. I've had colleagues as I travel in Northeast Asia say, you know, in this new posture of moving towards South and Southeast Asia, does that mean less commitment to here? I don't think it means anything of the kind. I don't see any reduction of our commitment to the defense of South Korea, for example, or to deal with the North Korea issue. The second general point I'd make is I can't discern a conflict between the U.S. and South Korea in Southeast Asia relations, by which I mean, certainly not military, but what I mean here is any sort of significant divergence of perspectives or interests or values that would immediately or on the front end constrain our ability to work together. Sure, there's going to be competition of companies on trade, on markets, investment. As far as I'm concerned, that's terrific. I mean, that's what competitive competition and cooperative competition should be all about. But I think that in the overall spectrum, South Korea being brought in to work with the U.S. and U.S. being brought in to work with South Korea on issues like perhaps vectoring development assistance, working on pandemics, working on counterterrorism, HADR, maritime patrolling, not only would, I think, offer a public good, but contribute to Southeast Asia's fundamental interest in having a number of parties at play in the region so they don't become overly reliant. And from the U.S. point of view, I'd certainly like it to be South Korea rather than countries that are not U.S. allies, not U.S. partners, and don't share U.S. values. So I would say I will just conclude there and suggest that two areas that we really ought to look forward to in the future, maybe in more detail, is where Chorus fits into regional integration, into TPP, and I know Ellen's going to talk on it, and I don't want to stomp on her turf. She's going to get over it. That's just one area. And the last area I would say is, what is Korea's vision for intra-Asian integration? That is to say, the +3 CJK efforts within the Asian element that's not trans-Pacific. And how does that vision square with American interests in a trans-Pacific relationship? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Limaye.
Thank you, Sarah. I share the appreciation already expressed by my two colleagues here. The challenge handed to me was to try to pull their presentations together and address the triangular relationship as a whole. A super topic. It's why it's called Super Tuesday, right? I finally figured that out. Okay. And, you know, at first sight, it should be easy. It's not only that Korea and U.S. goals are substantially the same, but ASEAN's expressed goals are similar. Likewise, so, you know, what's the big deal? But hanging over this whole topic are several challenges that I will address in part, at least. One is China. Another is the sort of future coherence of ASEAN as a grouping, whether it can hold together in the circumstances, and the third is doubts about the United States. So there are elements of all of those sort of under the surface here. The premises of my paper is that a triangle among these three areas should be non-exclusive and should go out of its way to create the impression that it is, in fact, non-exclusive. We have, after all, a Japan ROK-US strategic dialogue. More triangles are better than fewer triangles. But it's important that they have flexible boundaries. Similarly, I'm proposing that the triangular relationship that we're discussing here evolve within regional and trans-Pacific organizations and institutions. I was asked to address economic issues particularly, but they are, in fact, the most promising, and they have a lot of momentum behind them. In Asia, particularly, these economic agreements, the noodle bowl, as you've heard, have geopolitical significance. I go so far as to say that the free trade agreements and similar agreements within Asia are the geopolitical expression of relations among states, expressions of friendship and non-aggression, comparable in certain ways to earlier treaties such as Treaty of Friendship, Commerce and Navigation, or even to certain kinds of security treaties. So what's going on here may seem eye-glazing, but a lot of progress politically and strategically is being made at the same time. And Korea is right there in the middle of all of this. Okay, why regionalism? Why am I plugging the triangle within the regional context? This is a core ASEAN strategy. For a long time, every innocuous memo and communique that came out of these regional meetings listed ASEAN as being in the driver's seat, After a while, sort of jokes began to develop about, backseat drivers and flat tires and things like this. And so now the new image is fulcrum. But in any case, ASEAN insists on hosting these meetings and controlling the agenda, taking advantage of the politics of weakness, if you like. Regionalism in Asia, I believe, is here to stay. I like to talk about the 4 R's that motivate it, particularly from ASEAN's point of view. First R is the regionalization of the global economy, production networks and the like driven by the private sector. The second R is reaction to regional agreements elsewhere, as well as reaction to the Asian financial crisis of 97-98. The third R is the resurgence of China, the need to embed China in a host of organizations and rules-based and consensus-based organizations. And the fourth is rivalry among the regional powers. ASEAN has been very skillful at playing off suitors against each other. You could even add a fifth R, the re-engagement of the United States is very important for ASEAN to keep the United States in. So all of these things are going on as these regional meetings are planned and developed. Regionalism also has the advantage in Asia of being very open-ended. It's not rules-based, it's flexible, it corresponds to this fluid strategic environment in Asia. And it provides a neutral roof under which sensitive discussions can take place on the sidelines, sometimes between 2 or 3 powers, even if the meeting itself formally is 16, or in the case of the East Asian Summit, actually 18 countries. So you have a safe environment, so to speak. These agreements, these organizations, the ASEAN Plus ones, do not exclude China. That's a big plus, given China's fears of exclusion and encirclement. And the U.S. Supports them. This was not the case under Mahathir, if you may remember his proposals for an East Asian caucus or East Asian group. The Clinton administration supported them. The Bush-George W. administration more or less dismissed them as talk shops and concentrated on post-9/11 strategies and on sort of freedom and democracy. But it's not black and white, but this administration has really thrown its weight behind support for these organizations, and the proof is sending the president abroad. If there's any single constraint, I'm sure Jack Pritchard will agree, if there's any single constraint on U.S. foreign policy that is consistent, it's limitations on the president's travel time. What? You want to travel halfway around the world? What are you talking about? Well, that happens in the White House all the time. So the U.S. has put Secretary Clinton and President Obama out in the field, and that is also I think because of our economic interest in the Asia-Pacific, if nothing else, and because of the rise of China, I think that the U.S. support for regionalism is going to persist no matter who is elected. Now, Korea has a real role here. You've heard some of it. It was a distinguished Korean known to many of us in this room, Han Sung-ju, who chaired the East Asia Vision Group, which produced a report in 2001 sketching the pillars of East Asian integration, the economic pillar, political security pillar, and socio-cultural pillar. And of these three, the economic one is the most fully developed. Korea is, as Balbina said, is also large and wealthy enough to have some influence, but small enough not to be perceived as a threat. And that's the politics of a medium power here are very useful in this sense. Just as Korea is the only medium power in the G20, it's also more or less the only medium power in the East Asian constellation. Korea engages very vigorously in one of the chief characteristics of East Asian regionalism, which is you might call competitive cooperation. Everybody loves everybody. You have to understand that. Now, everybody is very friendly to everybody. But in fact, this rivalry that I mentioned leads them to compete with each other in a positive win-win kind of a way. It's very constructive, this competitive cooperation. One manifestation of it is infrastructure diplomacy, you might call it. Korea is very active in its construction companies, its aid programs, and so forth. So infrastructure becomes one way to show ASEAN how much you love them, and also to have some nice business for your friends, funded by the Asian Development Bank and others. It's very constructive. Korea has also, without provoking China directly, has gone out of its way to encourage the inclusion of India. We talked a little bit about India. In the maps I had as a child, Satu, you put the Americans in the middle, of course, and so you had to divide the Eurasian continent, right? And so India was always grouped with the Middle East, just as it was in the State Department for a while. But if you think about the geopolitics of these agreements that I keep harping on, you can see that, that there's China and on one side and Japan on the other. Korea has a sort of geopolitical interest in reaching out to India, and India has become a member of the East Asian Summit, and Korea is very much a backer of that development. I want to mention the TPP here. This is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a very high standard trade agreement proposed by 4 small countries, Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, and Brunei. The United States took about a year to decide whether it wanted to join, but it has joined. It has the advantage of keeping trade liberalization moving forward at a very high level. It includes the so-called Singapore issues, which are not in the current stalled Doha round in Geneva. These are investment, intellectual property, competition policy, which is antitrust, and government procurement. It also has labor and environment provisions in it. So the U.S. Congress, to the extent that it likes any trade agreement, really does like the TPP. So the latest meeting just took place in Australia, which has joined the TPP. Korea is thinking about it. Now that KORUS has passed, Korea may well join. There's 2 big problems, though, or challenges, shall we say, with the TPP that we perhaps could discuss. One is that it could widen the rich-poor gap within ASEAN. That is, the wealthier members of ASEAN, Singapore, a co-founder, and Malaysia are in it. Vietnam has joined it, and that's one of the poorer members. It's kind of an anomaly. But generally speaking, there's no hope whatever at this point for Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. Though that gap could get wider if the momentum of trade liberalization picks up and they're left out of it. It is open-ended. Anybody can join, and that leads me to the other challenge of TPP, which is China. They are putting out a line that China is being excluded. This is encirclement. It's Cold War policy. The fact is that China could perfectly well say, look, we can't meet your standards now, but we are committed to reform, and we'd like to aim high. Please let us come in as observers. That would be perfectly appropriate. It's not at all the line they're taking at the moment, which is extremely hostile. So the management of the triangular relationship has to take place in an environment that is somewhat fraught with these tensions, and it's not in any of our interest to continue to exacerbate Chinese fears of encirclement. If you think of a map of East Asia, you can sort of understand the circlement concept, because from Alaska, Japan, Taiwan, all the way around to Thailand, they are friends of the United States or allies for the most part. But nevertheless, we should all try to rebut this particular Chinese line. I'd like to close by just floating a few ideas. The real gap, the biggest gap actually, is not the subject of this conference, but it's within Northeast Asia. It's the China, Japan, Korea gap. There are free trade agreements running north-south, but not east-west in Northeast Asia. And for the benefit of everyone, a regional free trade agreement, creation of a single market, and so forth within greater East Asia yields multiples of benefits compared to just ASEAN itself or some of these bilaterals. So if a Japan-China-Korea agreement could take place, that could help to round out the whole region and lead to a single, ideally a single agreement, although that may be too hard. I also think Korea should join the TPP, but making it clear that at the same time they would pursue agreements with China. I think ASEAN members that are not already in TPP ought to accelerate the pace of economic reform, as I just mentioned. In order to restore credibility to our leadership, the United States needs to get its political and economic house in order. I don't know about you, but I rush to turn off the news every time it comes on the radio. It's also dreadful. I want to throw out two more far-out suggestions to close. One is that Southeast Asians have tremendous diplomatic skills. I mean, they were at each other's throats in the late 40s. They had communist movements, insurgencies. Indonesia pursued confrontasi against Malaysia. Even now, they have some minor border clashes, but they have not gone to war with each other since the formation in 1967, ASEAN members, and they have huge experience now in diplomatic subtlety, if you like, or slow consensus building. Indonesia offered to help mediate some of the conflicts of Southeast Asia, and they were of Northeast Asia, and Indonesians were quickly laughed away. Don't be ridiculous. Solve your own problems first. But I wouldn't rule out the possible use of Southeast Asian diplomats in Northeast Asia. And the second is, of course, the tantalizing question of North Korea. If we were to see something like a Myanmar-type evolution in North Korea. It doesn't seem likely now, but surprises happen. Then, both Seoul and ASEAN should press, I think, for Pyongyang's inclusion in some of these regional organizations that I've described. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers and for putting a lot of substance and analysis into this triangle. That was just a triangle, a concept at the moment when we started this workshop and this seminar. We have about 30 minutes for question and answer, and we'd be happy to answer your questions if there is. Please raise your hand and identify your name and your affiliation, and there's microphones going around.
And not just questions, but arguments.
And comments as well, absolutely. Right here, Ambassador Hubbard.
Thank you very much. I'm Tom Hubbard from McCarty Associates. I'm one of the people in the room that has spent a lot of time in both Southeast Asia and Korea. And in fact, I still go to both places quite often. And what I don't think we've heard yet this morning or this afternoon is kind of the scale of the Korean presence in Southeast Asia. I almost always fly to Southeast Asia on Korean Air through Incheon International Airport, which in fact has become a hub to Southeast Asia for many people going there. And I'm struck by how many Koreans I see on those airplanes. In fact, I've often taken a Friday night flight from Manila, from Seoul or Incheon to Manila, and the plane is always packed, either with single men or honeymooners. And in fact, you find in resorts all over the Philippines Korean honeymooners. And when you get off that 747 in Manila, you see at least 500 golf bags come off. It's really quite a sight. And similarly all over the region, the first sign you see leaving the airport in Hanoi is a sign for POSCO Engineering and Consulting. I've visited an export processing zone in Ho Chi Minh City where they have, they have, I guess, 4 international schools, the smallest of which is the English school, but they have a Chinese school, a Japanese school, and the largest of all is the Korean school. So, Ellen, do you or some of you have a sense of the actual scale of Korean presence in Southeast Asia?
I could start, Balbina. I put in my paper a few numbers that I thought were interesting. Of course, Koreans are the second largest expatriate community in Vietnam after the Taiwanese. And there's been a trend also to send Korean students to Southeast Asia, to some countries in Southeast Asia for education, perhaps because entry in Korea to the universities is too hard, but also because there are some countries where they can learn English and Chinese at the same time. The biggest partner seems to be Vietnam, but also Philippines and Malaysia. I think I read here that the Philippines accounts for 50% of Korean students in the region, Singapore for 25%, Malaysia 10%. Of course, Koreans are still coming to the United States. So that's another form of contact. Also, you didn't mention intermarriage. There's Korean fishermen and farmers are having a lot of trouble attracting Korean women. So they have been importing Southeast Asian brides, and Southeast Asian workers have come to Korea. Apparently 30% of the foreign workforce in Korea is Southeast Asian. So
Can I just add kind of a comment here? You mentioned the particular Vietnam connection, which is very close, and I think actually was partially inspired by our Vietnam experience.
The war, yeah.
We sort of forget the history that that Filipinos participated in large numbers in the Korean War.
Right.
And Koreans participated, and Filipinos participated in large numbers in the Vietnam War. But some of the
300,000.
some of the leading Korean conglomerates, the Chaebol, really got their start during the Vietnam War, and the company, the home company of Korean Air, Hanjin, actually began as a transport company in Vietnam, supporting our mutual forces. So it is quite striking.
It's quite a significant presence. I think it was 300,000 Koreans, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, I'm cutting off Balbina.
No, did you also have something?
No, thanks to our research assistant, Alex Forster, I have some data, but what's really striking is on all of these fronts, we talk, about marriage and migration and labor and soft power. But, if you look at FDI statistics for Indonesia, Korea is fourth in 2009. This is all from the Korean government website. Very high in the Philippines, fifth in Thailand, Vietnam. So, in other words, in a lot of areas, it's not the top. But the numbers are very striking for two things for me from a distance. One is they're steadily upwards and quite high. I mean, compared to the scale. And second, they seem to be well distributed. I mean, I haven't been able to dig into this, and I was surprised, for example, Korea ODA flows are not particularly high into Malaysia, for example, because Malaysia is also somewhat more developed than others. But if you look at Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Philippines, Vietnam, Korea is in all cases in the top 6. So it's in a number of ways, whether it's FDI, trade, ODA, it's quite well represented in the region amongst the bigger players, and quite a hefty jump.
And I think that's also the interesting distinction is there is a distinction within Southeast Asia of the more developed, like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the less developed. And that's where you see the sharpest trajectory. Because a lot of these numbers are from 2009. You're going to see a very sharp increase in 2012. For example, POSCO, of course, the South Korean steelmaker, just announced a new $6 billion mill, the first overseas integrated mill they're going to build. So that will immediately bump up South Korea's ranking. Note that ASEAN is South Korea's third largest trading partner now, after the EU and China and the EU and China, first and second. And now ASEAN is also the second largest destination for South Korean foreign direct investment after the United States. So it is actually very significant. I mean, these numbers are really quite astonishing. The other interesting thing is that it's not just the chaebol. In Cambodia alone, you have 2,500 small to medium enterprises of Korean companies. So the Korean sort of engagement is across the board. It is, it's cultural, it's through these educational programs, it's through the small companies, the larger companies, and with this very, broad vision.
If I may say one other philosophical thing, and it came to me because I was doing some interviews elsewhere, and I've been working on, I was working on Japan. And it was quite interesting. I asked why this was in the case of India, Ambassador. Koreans were very heavily represented in Indian white goods, meaning appliances and a whole sector. And so I was interviewing Japanese and Koreans, and one thing that came to me, and I don't even pretend to be an expert on this, but just an anecdote that I found very interesting. The Koreans explained to me that their goods were somewhat less priced and more appropriate to developing markets. In a way that the higher-end Japanese products were more difficult to function in a market with problems with electricity and infrastructure. So that was one. And the second is, and it's hard to quantify in social science terms, but therefore Korean risk-taking because of the margins of gain in untended markets was much higher. And so risk proclivity was higher. And I don't know how to quantify this algorithmically, but it struck me as a very important element of the Korean entrance into these markets.
And also, I read that there are about 200,000 Southeast Asian workers in Korea as well, so there's exchange on that level. Further questions right there in the middle, and then we'll go to Mr. Moore.
Eric McFadden.
Yeah.
Eric McFadden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I guess everybody that looks at ASEAN and so forth thinks of all the alphabet soup. And let me add a little bit to that with TPP and what I say is PTA. And what I mean is the pivot toward Asia. Ellen, would you comment on what I think is a strange timing of TPP and PTA? It was kind of like two jabs at China. At least that's the way the Chinese appeared to take it as far as I'm concerned. So that turns out, of course, to be pea soup.
Well, Eric, I don't think I quite agree with you on the question of timing. Let's not forget that one of the most important things the United States can do for itself and the world is to grow faster. And the only way we're going to get out of this sluggish period post-recession is to export and develop more vigorous markets. And where are those markets? Guess what? They're in the Asia-Pacific. So I think if you read President Obama's and Secretary Clinton's explanation of the pivot, you'll find that the economic element plays a big part in it. And as far as you know, and for TPP, I think there the timing is sort of that we've beaten the Doha horse as hard as we can, and it still isn't going to work. I'm a big WTO fan. I'd much rather have WTO than a high standard agreement there than this compartmentalization. But the reality is that we've got to keep the momentum going. And even Doha doesn't address the issues that are of most importance to American companies. But I mean, Korea, I should comment here, Korea used to be a rampant thief of intellectual property. They had this attitude that, they were victims and sort of the world owes it to them, and they really had no hesitation in stealing things, intellectual property, which is anything basically that goes on between your ears that makes money. That's one way to define IP. A rock song or whatever.
That must not make money then.
Yeah, and then they became entrepreneurs and inventors themselves, and they moved over to the IP side. So I think TPP is justified in a trade and economic policy sense. In interagency circles, you can imagine the wars that must be going on between USTR and the State Department, and the NSC in the middle and so forth. But as far as sticking it in China's eye, I mean, I don't. China has chosen to take an attitude that anything we do is aimed at them. We stick Marines on rotation in Australia, 7,000 miles away, and they think it's all about them. It's not. It's all about me, is what they're saying, and it's really not all about them. I think one of China's handicaps in the region is that they are so consumed, understandably so, with getting rich before they get old, that they haven't really thought beyond China as to what their vision is for the region. The good side of that from Southeast Asian government's point of view is that Chinese don't interfere with them and lecture them the way we do. The bad part is nobody knows what China wants, right? But I think this hostility to TPP and the pivot is really, I think Chinese ought to look in a mirror before for that. So I appreciate your question, but I don't think I agree with the premises. We can discuss it over beer.
If I could say something about
Yeah.
this, I mean, I agree with you partially, but also I understand what you're saying. I mean, yes, it's not about China, that's one of the big problems. They always think it's about them. The other half of that side, though, is that it's not the United States as the sole actor either. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that timing is as much accidental as it is also purposeful, right? And there was a very interesting, you can't look at this as just U.S. took these two actions and China reacted this way. The U.S. took this action, but actually some interesting developments were occurring on the Chinese side.
Yeah, right.
In the 1990s and 2000s, we had a period of where the United States was very skeptical of multilateral of using multilateral ways of engaging in Asia. And it was China that actually used multilateralism very much. It's kind of their cloak. It was a very safe way for them to start exerting their growing power. Also because they weren't confident yet. Suddenly, now in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a reversal. You see the United States very much willing to use existing multilateral organizations to kind of, stave off, and exactly what you were saying, Satu, about sort of taking some of the edge off of the U.S. policies. And China suddenly breaking out of that and saying, now we're really willing to step out. And in many ways, China really did itself a disservice by antagonizing a lot of these other countries in a bilateral way, Vietnam, Philippines. And so I think both of these trends were occurring together. So I don't view this as the U.S. sort of going out and moving pieces on the chessboard.
Yeah, there's a certain fluidity to all these things, Admiral. I was struck that this administration took some convincing to engage in trade discussions at all. And if I recall correctly, some of our friends in the region were heavily pressing us to move on trade. So less than that we sort of drove the train, we were kind of brought into being more active is one way I'd put it. The second is these things come and go. I was thinking when I look back at Japan in the mid-90s, certainly after Plaza, one could imagine Japan was extremely interested in regional institution building because that whole model of the lead goose in the flying geese pattern, Japan was going to lead regional multilateralism. It was going to be an intra-Asian, Japan-led international order in the Asia-Pacific. And it made, there was a kind of a logic to it given the value of the yen and the enormous growth of the Japanese economy. Then we had a period where China resisted all multilateral efforts, and we were at best dismissive or cold or lukewarm or however you want to put it. Then all of a sudden we flopped. So this process, and I think Ellen's point here is very apropos, is multilateralism is an expression of underlying competitive elements. It isn't something that's artificial in the region. And we're going to see this drop and play as powers ebb and flow and see how they can shape multilateralism to its uses. It makes perfect sense for us to shape institutions and multilateral organizations and groupings or whatever you want to call these things. Some of them which don't even have nouns, but none of them which are institutions in the formal sense. Do things we want them to do. So I think that game is still very much in the offing, and I wouldn't be surprised if China comes up with alternatives that seek to blunt the trans-Pacific element of these institutions. I would find it surprising if Beijing didn't try to do that. Thanks, Brian.
Sure, quickly, yes.
I guess I'm disappointed, given the importance of the U.S.-China relationship, that Beijing and Washington aren't clever enough to have handled this thing differently and made it come out better for both sides. It seems to me they should look at it as an obligation to avoid some of these things you've just described.
Well, there is a difference in between Chinese rhetoric and Chinese behavior. They bluster and criticize leaders personally with fiery rhetoric, but they don't necessarily act on that. So I hope that particularly after this transition in Chinese leadership that we'll have a continuation of a management. I think that Ma Ying-jeou's reelection in Taiwan is a big plus. I want to make it clear that having just taught a for 2 years a non-credit course on China's century of humiliation. I am very much in sympathy with the feelings and the suspicions that the Chinese harbor. But picking up on what Balbina said, it amazed many of us when 15 years of patient good neighbor diplomacy in Southeast Asia was sort of thrown aside with this 9-dash map and claiming the whole South China Sea and so forth and so on. So there are many Chinas. You know, there's an active debate within China, and we sort of look from afar and we say, oh, there's this strategy, they're doing this, and they're all in agreement. I think we're going to see a lot of evolution and mixed signals coming out of China, but I think in the end, both the U.S. and China can live with each other. One difference in China policy in this country is that we tend to appoint people who really are good and they're professional. We don't dump political campaigners into Asia positions. There's a fair bit of continuity there. Rob is laughing. It's a fair bit of continuity. Wouldn't you agree in sort of same goals?
Let's have Mr. Hwang.
Rob Warren from DACOR. Thank you for a really excellent series of comments. I have two areas that I don't think you've given enough attention to. One is APEC. APEC is an organization that's regional and involves Taiwan too. And I would hope that there's some way it could be integrated into this triangle. The second one is, Ellen just touched on it briefly, and that's North Korea. North Korea has been invited to a number of ASEAN activities. Its attendance has been erratic, to say the least. But couldn't this be part of the triangle?
I apologize for not developing APEC. I claim there were space limits on the paper, but I'm actually a big fan of very nitty-gritty trade facilitation, port security, the kinds of stuff that goes on within APEC. And so when I said trans-Pacific organizations, I had APEC in mind, but I didn't develop it. And since I did mention North Korea, let me turn to the others and see what they have to say about that.
Point very well taken. And frankly, I was happy about this project because I didn't have to talk about North Korea. But I actually did mention it in the conclusion of my paper. The really interesting thing, and Satu, you alluded to this, the majority of Southeast Asian nations actually have diplomatic relations with North Korea. This is actually very interesting. And as you know, the diplomatic relation overlaps with Seoul. Now, you know, the Cold War, by the way, the end of the Cold War was a very important aspect of why South Korea was able to reach out globally. And I discussed that in greater length in my paper. So we all know that the Cold War is very much still alive on the Korean Peninsula, and it very much impedes South Korea's ability to have any kind of creative policy with North Korea. But interestingly, the end of the Cold War did huge favors for South Korea as far as Southeast Asia. Because all during the Cold War, it was a zero-sum game between the two Koreas on who could engage. You know, if one country had that was it. You were cut off, right? So it was very, very restrictive for both countries. Now you have an interesting situation, and North Korea's limited trade is actually with Southeast Asia. They've got trade with Indonesia and others, with grains and so on. So, and of course, there's some interesting security links with Burma. And so it does open up an intriguing area on the margins of possibly being able to coordinate some sort of relationship. Very interestingly, a lot of these Korean restaurants that are opening up in Cambodia are actually run by North Koreans. So South Korean tourists who are flocking there purposely go there, and that's one way they actually meet North Koreans, because they're staffed by North Koreans. So, it's the oddest thing where you have South and North sort of trying to engage on a personal level in Cambodia or other areas of Southeast Asia. So you're right, but I would say that it's really on the margins, though.
Only two thoughts on this. One is, it's occurred to me before, and I don't want to get too wacky, but the Southeast Asians say their approach towards Myanmar, everyone claims that their policy approach towards Myanmar brought about the opening, right? Not talking to them and imposing sanctions brought them to their knees, and now they're talking. Or, if I talk to some of my Southeast Asian friends, well, constructive engagement with your next door neighbor is really, you don't have much choice, and that's probably run. So either claim, I don't take a position, I don't know, but it has struck me that is it possible, given these ties that Balbina has spoken about and what Ellen mentioned in the past, is it's not a model, but maybe the way they approached Myanmar is not irrelevant to what can be done on North Korea. So there's some, if you will, socialization of how to think about the problem. The second observation I'd make relating to North Korea is a fundamental change in the globalization and integration patterns in Asia over the last 15, 20 years is the increasing integration between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. In fact, the pace of the Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia integration is, of course, faster than intra-Southeast Asian integration, which means that Southeast Asia has a great stake in outcomes and, God forbid, war, collapse, whatever, some sort of problem in Northeast Asia would have enormous impacts on Southeast Asia. So that's another thing why within the ARF process, as you well know, Southeast Asia has been keen to do whatever small bits they can to draw North Korea out. I think there's some room there to maybe build on that.
Just to build on that quickly, there was a World Bank study that looked at the trade in parts and components within Asia, and it's something like 4 times the level that you would otherwise predict. And that, of course, is linked in part to the negotiation of zero tariffs on telecommunications and information technology and services. So the countries that have been able to find a niche export parts and components to Korea, Japan, and ultimately China for assembly and re-export.
We'll go to the middle back and then to Dr. Rothman.
And in fact, if you can,
Thank you. My name is Jae Kyung Park. I recently joined the CSIS as a visiting scholar. I came from the ROK Foreign Affairs Ministry. My immediate previous position was the director for ASEAN cooperation at the ministry. I'm very pleased and excited at being in this seat today. Thank Dr. Balbina Hwang first for reminding us of the New Asia Initiative. It has been very successful, and I'm very glad that I was in the middle of those New Asia Initiative. And the New Asia Initiative, as you mentioned, is true that the ASEAN is at its core, and the ASEAN-Korea relationship culminated in 2010 by establishing the strategic partnership. And we called the 2009 as a watershed year. There was the ASEAN-ROK commemorative summit. That means 10 ASEAN leaders came to Jeju Island to have a meeting with President Lee Myung-bak. It's quite unusual case because of so-called ASEAN centrality. The ASEAN leaders do not want to travel abroad for summit meetings. They would rather have other leaders to be in their territories, but it's quite unusual. And the FTA investment treaty was signed on the occasion of that summit meeting, which so completed all the FTA systems, service, and goods and investment. That was made in 2009. And recently, the trade volumes, it surpassed 120 billion US dollars. As I think as all of you know that the Korea's total trade volume is around 1,000 billion US dollars. So maybe with China, it's around 21 or 22 last year. So 120 is the second largest trading partner of ASEAN. I think President Lee Myung-bak understands the significance or importance of ASEAN, particularly the economic importance, partly because of his personal affection to this region and personal experience of having business when he was a businessman before. And annually 4 million Korean visitors as newlyweds or for business, for students, they visit this region, and 30% of Korea's ODA is directed to these regions. And nearly 10,000 registered Korean companies are doing business in these regions. And my second comment is what Dr. Satu Limaye mentioned. I was interested into hearing that the U.S. engagement with this region, one of the element was the imbalancing between the mainland and the maritime. And you mentioned the trade statistics. Previously, it was 85% for the maritime regions. It's now addressing the imbalance. But I think there is like inevitable dilemma because there are CLMV countries in the mainland. So their economic size is still very low. So there should be like inevitable dilemma or limits for increasing or addressing the gap. Rather, geostrategically or politically, there is a certain point that U.S., as you mentioned throughout the LMI initiative, they see the importance of these regions because the Chinese influence have been increased too much. The Lao PDL and Cambodia, so they are so much tilted towards Myanmar too. And those countries fortuitously will assume the ASEAN chairmanship this year, Cambodia, and next year, Brunei, and then 2013, Myanmar, and Lao PDL 2014. So that's my comment. And question is, again, to Dr. Lima. You stopped by mentioning the ASEAN Plus 3 and then CJK cooperations. I wonder, what do you think about the two big multilateral institutions like ASEAN Plus 3 and EAS? It seems that the Chinese seem to think that EAS is now becoming just a leaders-led forum. It's not a serious institution-building mechanism. So slightly they feel happy or happier with the U.S. participation in the EAS system. So that's my question. And then the last question is directed to Dr. Frost. The difference between the Korea and the U.S. vis-a-vis the ASEAN is their perception or the strategic importance for the two countries. For Korea, we see South Asian region as the region itself. But for the U.S., for me, it seems that there is more, which is the counterbalancing with China's influence. It's more than half, in a sense. So what do you think about the U.S. engagement with this region as the region in itself, or more because of China's influence? Thank you.
Let's take one last question, and then we can answer all of them together. Dr. Rosman.
I'm Gil Rosman, Princeton University. I'm asking about Japan. I don't think enough has been said about sort of the strategic interest in Korea and Japan cooperating. After all, they are an ASEAN Plus 3 together, and China has much valued that organization. And now we have the CJK FTA talks. And so it seems to me that lately the Japanese have been much more interested in a kind of regional cooperation with Korea. But I also wonder if Koreans aren't thinking more of undercutting the Japanese role in Southeast Asia, which used to be the dominant one in terms of ODA and markets. And so to what extent is there a kind of Korean willingness to coordinate more closely with Japan on the various issues affecting the region?
Take a first stab at answering the questions?
Yes, our Korean colleague from MOFA, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted you're here to set us right. On the asymmetry, I'll only say one thing. You're quite right. As I said, I didn't suggest that the asymmetry will be fixed. I don't think we'll ever be completely balanced. The interests are too disparate and too different. And Cambodia and Laos will have inherent limits given the scale of the countries and the size of the economies and populations. But it's very clear that a real opening in Burma that attracts U.S. companies and U.S. engagement, along with Vietnam, and the centrality still, I mean, maybe someone will correct me, I'm yet to know of an American company that has left Thailand, notwithstanding the political difficulties there. It's still a very important hub for all kinds of economic activity. My simple point is that as Vietnam opens, Burma opens, if it does, in fully, and still the kind of anchor of Thailand in mainland Southeast Asia. The imbalance between our trade with maritime and mainland Southeast Asia and investment and corporate behavior and other things will diminish. Whether it'll ever disappear or they'll be equal, I don't even think that's desirable and necessary. But I quite see your point about some limits in Cambodia.
Can I say something about this issue before you continue? Sure. I think that distinction between maritime and mainland is important. And when as part of the New Asia Initiative, Lee Myung-bak said South Korea can serve as a bridge. Actually, South Korea can serve as a much more useful bridge for mainland Asia than maritime Asia. And in fact, you do have the Thais and the Indonesians, Malaysians, others saying, well, I mean, we've been pretty successful in following Korea's economic model. We're already pretty far along. And, essentially they're experimenting democracies. What's interesting is in mainland Asia. And so you've got Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, these countries who have much more similar experience with South Korea. Complete destruction through war, civil wars. They're in a much, further end stage. And I didn't emphasize enough Korea's role in serving as a model for democratization. And Korea can teach these countries in a way that's not as much, over the head as Americans are, and in a much, and stand out in a way that China certainly can't, and in a much more dynamic way than Japan can. So that's actually a very crucial role that South Korea can play.
Yeah, thank you very much, Balbina. That's the second point is your question, sir, about ASEAN +3 and CJK versus EAS, China's concerns about too broad. As I tried to suggest, there is a certain kind of competition going on in populating these multilateral institutions, the agenda of them, the stakeholder membership. I can't imagine if you're in Beijing that you think something called the East Asia Summit, and I don't mean to be pedantic, but something called the East Asia Summit should necessarily include Australia, New Zealand, and India. I mean, it seems axiomatic that you might be suspicious of what the U.S. is up to by including these countries, or suspicious of Japan for welcoming them, or Korea for welcoming them. But clearly we have interest in broadening out. Our interest isn't, I would put it this way, in my thinking about this is, the configuration of institutions is less important to me than keeping trans-Pacific ties on all of these dimensions. That means alliances, partnerships, trade, and open regionalism. Because the minute the regionalism closes to us, it's problematic. So exact configurations, after all, we're in a little bit of constant negotiation with ASEAN too as to what topics should be discussed in these organizations. So it's not just China. Everybody is trying to get the right fit in there. And as for Professor Rosman's question, Japan, ROK, what is visible to me anyways over the last 3-4 years is if you look at Japanese activities in Southeast Asia, they don't have as much ODA. But you see a clear effort to be more active. And it's clear on the provision of Coast Guard ships. It's clear on the provision of high-level visits. It's clear on the provision of developing more East Asia aid, like it's called the East Asia Economic Research Institute, all kinds of things to keep the Japanese role going. How much the balance is between competition and cooperation, I don't know. I find it hard to believe at this stage, though my colleagues will correct me, that there'll be a lot of joint Tokyo-Seoul cooperation in Southeast Asia. Right now, I tend to see more of the competitive element to get their companies, trade issues, have political, and but Japan is not entirely quiescent in the region, and it's clear, especially over the last 2-3 years, they've really beefed up key visits and leadership visits and things like that.
I think one exception is to what you just said, Satu, is the Chiang Mai initiative. Which, is a currency swap arrangement that is also discussing regional bond markets and some other things. And I think the reason that where China-Japan relations are actually reasonably good is that they're all finance ministry people. I mean, I worked in the Treasury Department for 3 years. It's like the Navy, Eric. I mean, the navies of the world sort of understand each other. Finance ministers understand each other. And it's a very technical field where Japan has a huge amount of expertise. So what I'm hearing is that, they do disagree about, whether currency X should be included in the basket, reference basket, technical stuff. But most of the time, I think they get along pretty well. Shall I? Oh, go ahead, because I have a question.
One final word is, Professor Rosman, I think you actually nailed exactly on the head the issue. The issue is not, the title of our program is South Korea, Southeast Asia, and U.S., triangle, and is there a gap? The real gap is actually between Japan and South Korea in terms of, where from the U.S. perspective, it would very much benefit to have the U.S.-Japan alliance, U.S.-South Korea alliance working very closely together in a parallel way, and then even making that part of the triangle even stronger.
There was a question put to me. Shall I address it, Sarah?
I think there's a time for quick comment.
Yeah, quick comment. I was asked whether there's a difference, as I understand it, between the Korean assessment of Southeast Asia as a region unto itself, so to speak, versus a U.S. view purportedly looking at the region as sort of in the U.S.-China context. And actually, I don't think there is much of a difference, and I'll just tick off some of the obvious ways in which Southeast Asia matters to the United States, whether China exists or not, and that is, first of all, the sea lines of communication, the Strait of Malacca, the importance of the region, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which is a vital interest of ours. The second cluster would be the role of Islam. Southeast Asia has more Muslims than the entire Middle East put together, including Iran. And they don't like to be called, quote unquote, moderate Muslims, but for shorthand, this is a region of the world where Islam is very moderate. That helps. Thirdly, there's virtually no global so-called non-traditional threat that can be solved without some degree of Southeast Asian participation. I'm thinking about disease, thinking about piracy, climate change. You know, you have to have them in there. The role of democracy and the transition away from military dictatorship has already been mentioned. We were the first to send to appoint a full-scale ambassador to ASEAN, hosted in Jakarta, and I really don't see that as a direct counter move to China or anything remotely like it.
I would also mention 30% of Americans who are foreign-born from Asia are from Southeast Asia. And you know, let's not forget ethnic politics in our country, because I mean there are ethnic politics and how we treat democracy issues, human rights issues, migration issues, refugee issues. It's not an irrelevant element of our relationship.
That's right.
Well, I think our speakers touched upon almost every issue related to Korea, Southeast Asia, U.S. relations. So please join me in thanking our three speakers.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for coming. And we have plenty of future seminars upcoming, including our academic paper series, as well as the next Korea Compass program. So thank you.
That was very dubious.
So much.
Hi, Tom. You have so much to contribute.